In a record-setting time of 73 days, General Tomoyuki Yamashita conquered what was considered to be the British bastion of the Far East, Singapore. Using superior tactics, the Japanese commander conducted a successful campaign against a numerically superior force. To the British, the loss of Singapore was a devastating blow. It not only humiliated them and made the white man appear less than invincible to the natives, it was the harbinger of the end of the colonial era. In November 1941, General Yamashita was summoned to Tokyo. There he was informed that he was to assume command of the 25th Army. This unit was already in training for the invasion of Malaya in the event Japan decided to go to war. If war came, Yamashita would be responsible for the capture of the Pearl of the Orient, the great British naval base on the island of Singapore. Yamashita accepted his command with mixed feelings, for he was well aware that his superiors, Generals Tojo and Sugiyama, did not like him. A highly talented officer, Yamashita had run afoul of the two by backing the Imperial Way faction. Both Tojo and Sugiyama belonged to the rival Control faction. During the 1930s, the Control faction felt that Japan needed to expand into China no matter what the consequences, even if that thrust the nation into a war with America and Great Britain. The Imperial Way group, on the other hand, wanted to establish military rule under the emperor. Russia was viewed as the main enemy, and this group felt that any Japanese expansion should be at the expense of the Soviet Union. Their contrasting philosophies escalated into rebellion in the 1930s, which resulted in Yamashita's banishment to the Manchurian frontier. With Tojo and Sugiyama in control of the army, Yamashita knew that he would be closely scrutinized and spied upon, and any failure would be punished by dismissal and humiliation. Even before Yamashita was named commander of the 25th Army, both Army and Navy staffs debated the strategy to be used in the invasion of Malaya and Singapore. The Navy felt that in order to ensure the safety of the troop transports, the Royal Air Force had to be eliminated. In contrast, the Army staff thought that this method would sacrifice the element of surprise, a factor they considered vital to the success of the operation. The Army reasoned that the British would not make any aggressive moves, even if they detected the approaching Japanese armada. Therefore, by the time the enemy realized they were at war, the Japanese Air Force would have already gained aerial supremacy by having surprise on their side. After much debate, the commander of the Japanese fleet for the invasion of Malaya, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, accepted the Army's proposal. Ozawa stated, "I say that the Navy should accept the Army's proposal even at the risk of annihilation." This effectively ended all debate. The actual site of the invasion was also decided prior to Yamashita's assuming command of the attack forces. The narrow neck of land known as the Kra Isthmus, which joins Thailand to Malaya, was the area designated to be attacked. The three main attack points on the isthmus were Singora and Patani in Thailand, and Kota Baru at the mouth of the Kelantan River in northern Malaya. Each of these three ports contained excellent anchorages and nearby airfields. The main landing was to take place at Singora, since it possessed the best beach for exploitation. What were Yamashita's feelings towards his country's preparation for war? The cause of this war is fundamentally economic. 50 years ago, Japan was more or less self-sufficient. The people could live off the land. Since then, the population has almost doubled, so that Japan has had to rely on outside sources of food supply and other economic requirements. In order to buy or import her commodities, she has had to pay ultimately in commodities. This effort on her part was prevented for one reason or another by other countries. Japan made attempts to solve the misunderstandings through peaceful methods, but when all her efforts were thwarted or negated, she felt it necessary to engage in open warfare. The general wrote these words shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Along with the majority of his countrymen, he did not consider war an infamous act, but rather a sacred duty. For the proposed invasion, the 25th Army was allotted 5 divisions. When Yamashita arrived at his new headquarters on Hainan Island, he reviewed the situation and made a startling suggestion. During an interview with Army Chief of Staff Sugiyama, he stated that 3 divisions would be more than enough for the operation, instead of the allotted 5. This was indeed surprising, since most commanders usually ask for more forces, not less. Yamashita, however, was astute enough to realize that the terrain of Malaya mitigated against the use of large numbers of troops. Fewer troops of superior quality, he felt, could move more rapidly. A total of 60,000 men were thus allocated to Yamashita for the operation. These men comprised the 5th and 18th Divisions, two of the best trained and most experienced units in the Imperial Army. The 3rd Division was the Imperial Guards. These formations would be supported by 2 regiments of heavy artillery and a tank brigade. The army forces would be protected by 450 land-based planes and 150 naval aircraft, along with the combined firepower of a battlecruiser and 10 destroyers. 2 of Yamashita's divisional commanders were also highly experienced and well liked by their troops. The 5th Division, veterans of the war in China, were commanded by Lieutenant General Takuro Matsui. His counterpart in the 18th Division was Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi. Yamashita liked both men, but felt a far closer bond of friendship with Mutaguchi, who had served as his chief of staff in 1937 with the Kwangtung Army. The remaining division, the Imperial Guards, was commanded by Lieutenant General Takuma Nishimura, a man who disliked Yamashita immensely and attempted to be as uncooperative as possible. In addition to being uncooperative, Nishimura was a close friend of the commander of the Southern Area Army and Yamashita's immediate superior, General Terauchi. He was also close to Army Chief of Staff Sugiyama. This friendship was to cause Yamashita many problems during the battle. Besides Nishimura, another individual who caused problems for Yamashita was his own chief of operations, Colonel Masanobu Tsuyi, an austere and sinister-looking person. Tsuyi was actually something of a government spy and dutifully reported all his impressions of the army commander to Prime Minister Tojo. Thus Yamashita was faced with enemies above him, beneath him, and on his own staff. Hardly an ideal situation for a man about to embark on the difficult venture of conquering the bastion of Singapore. The Japanese invasion plan called for the attacking forces to land at 3 beaches in the north, 2 in Thailand and 1 in Malaya. It was a daring plan calling for an attack on Singapore from the north, something the British considered highly unlikely. The defences of the naval base were designed to protect it from the obvious direction of a potential attack, the sea. The idea of driving a force down the spiny, jungle-covered back of Malaya, although deemed possible, was considered improbable. Yet that was precisely the route the Japanese intended to take. The Malayan Peninsula is roughly 400 miles long and varies in width from 200 to 60 miles. It is joined to Thailand by the narrow Kra Isthmus. Malaya has a spiny backbone, a ridge of jungle-covered hills rising to about 7,000 feet in the north and 3,000 feet in the south. On both sides of the mountains lie coastal plains. These contain hundreds of rivers and streams which meander their way from the mountains to the sea, cutting through endless areas of thick jungle and swamps. The great growth of jungle is so dense that in places visibility is reduced to yards. Cultivated areas feature miles of rice paddies or fields where 6-foot-high elephant grass, so sharp it can cut a man like 1,000 knives, grows wild. This, then, is Malaya, a land totally unsuited for military manoeuvre, or so the British thought. For the invasion, portions of the 5th and 18th Divisions were to land at the 2 points in Thailand between Singora and Patani, and at the Malayan port of Kota Baru. Once the 2 divisions had established their beachheads, it was planned to land Nishimura's less efficient Imperial Guards. A reserve division, the 56th, would remain on board ship in case help was required. Once the beachheads were consolidated, the Japanese force would move towards Singapore. Early in December, reconnaissance flights were sent over Thailand and Malaya. These flights confirmed the suspicion that British troops were deployed in defensive positions around Kota Baru. Opposition could be expected at this point. However, the Thai beaches were undefended. From his headquarters in Saigon, General Count Terauchi sent a signal to Yamashita confirming the date for the commencement of hostilities, December 8th, corresponding to December 7th, Hawaiian time. At the same time, he informed Yamashita that should a negotiated settlement occur in the diplomatic talks then taking place in Washington, the attack would be cancelled. Yamashita's forces were loaded into ships which then set sail for Malaya. The ships were divided into 5 separate convoys to avoid arousing suspicion. 2 convoys headed for Singora, 2 for Patani, and the remaining one for Kota Bharu. The landing of Mutaguchi's forces at Singora would mark the spearhead of the invasion. December 8th was Japan's day of destiny. The men of the 25th Army were filled with nationalist fervour. Finally, an opportunity had come to oust the hated barbarians and liberate Asia for the Asians. What of the opposing forces? Singapore had been a British possession since 1819, when, on the advice of Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, the East India Company purchased it from the Sultan of Johore. Raffles saw that Singapore was strategically placed for development as a port. Its position astride the India-China trade route made its possession vital. Singapore Island stretched 27 miles from east to west and 13 miles from north to south at its widest point. The Strait of Johore separates the island from Malaya. The strait varies in width from 600 to 5,000 yards. At its narrowest point, the British had constructed a causeway to the mainland. British control over Malaya itself dated back to the 19th century. During the years of the Great British colonial expansion, various trading companies negotiated trade agreements with the Sultan of Johore. By the 1920s, Malaya had become part of the vast British Empire, even though the Sultan continued to rule his own territory. Malaya and Singapore were both vitally important to the empire. Rubber and tin were Malaya's major products. These brought enormous wealth to British coffers. By 1941, rubber estates covered more than 3 million acres and produced over 1/3 of the world's output. Tin mining accounted for 58% of world production. The protection of Malaya and Singapore, however, was not given serious consideration until the 1920s. Up until then, Britain had no real rival for the colonies, but with the advent of Japanese expansion and naval growth, the British found themselves forced to pay attention to the defence of their Far Eastern colonies. Early reports on Singapore's defence stated that an attack from the Malayan Peninsula was impossible because of the terrain and the jungle. The only possible attack on the colony would come from the sea. From the early 20s and on into the 30s, debate ensued on the best ways to defend Singapore. The Air Ministry claimed that bombers protected by fighters could adequately protect the colony at a substantial financial saving over the construction of concrete bunkers with large gun emplacements. The Admiralty and the War Office, on the other hand, stuck to the gun theory, arguing that the heavy guns were more of a deterrent against attacking enemy ships than planes would be. In 1926, the Committee of Imperial Defence decided to implement the first stage in the development of Singapore's defence by ordering close and medium batteries along with 3 15-inch guns installed. Meanwhile, discussions continued between the opposing sides. In 1929, the Labour government took office in England with its platform of disarmament. Following the London Naval Treaty of 1930, work on Singapore's defences slowed greatly. By 1931, the Far Eastern situation had become critical following Japan's attack on Manchuria. Critics of disarmament quickly demanded that the work of Singapore's defences be continued. Once more squabbles occurred over the best method of defence. Finally, in May 1932, the government ruled that while guns should constitute the main weapons of defence, aircraft could provide valuable assistance. By 1935, the first stage of construction on the naval base at Singapore was complete. The government then gave permission to install heavy batteries along the southern coast. While a great naval base was being constructed at Singapore, work on airfield development in Malaya proceeded. 2 main sites were developed, one at Kota Bharu and the other at Kuantan. These airfields were located in the north so that the Royal Air Force would be able to detect the early approach of an enemy convoy. Unfortunately, the air forces themselves failed to consult with the army. The result was that the airfields could not be defended from attack. At the same time, the defence of eastern Malaya was completely neglected. In 1937, Major General W.S.S. Dobbie was appointed Commanding Officer, Malaya. From his new position, Dobbie took a fresh look at the entire defensive plan for Malaya and Singapore. He came to the uncomfortable conclusion that, contrary to earlier studies, landings on Malaya's eastern seaboard were possible, particularly during the period from October to March, the monsoon season, when the enemy could utilize the bad visibility to cloak their advance. Dobby went on to declare that the enemy would probably establish bases in Siam and make landings along the coast of that country. The general urged London to send additional reinforcements, but he was ignored. Dobby correctly saw what many others failed to. That was, the defence of the naval base in Singapore Island was bound up with the defence of the whole Malayan peninsula. Bobby's chief of staff was Colonel Arthur Percival, a man whose future would be intimately linked with the fate of Singapore. General Dobby attempted again in early 1938 to get his point across by sending another report to London. In the report, he said, "It is an attack from the northward that I regard as the greatest potential danger to the fortress. Such attack could be carried out during the period of the northeast monsoon. The jungle is not in most places impassable for infantry." Once more, the arguments fell on deaf ears. Meanwhile, in 1937, the Japanese launched a full-scale war with China. Dobby continued to warn London, but all he received in return were assurances and little in the way of funding and reinforcements. Eventually, the political situation in Europe began to deteriorate. That event caused a greater danger to Britain's Far Eastern colonial empire. Sensing the danger, the government sent an Indian brigade group, a mountain artillery regiment, and 2 bomber squadrons to Malaya in August 1939. Even with these reinforcements, however, the defensive situation in Malaya and Singapore remained pitiful. Only 58 aircraft were available, not one tank was to be found, and the number and quality of the troops left a great deal to be desired. If Japan attacked in 1939, the best the British would be able to do was to make a token defence. In 1940, Lieutenant General Bond was appointed General Officer commanding Singapore. He was horrified at the state of the defences there, and wanted to recruit the local labour force to construct additional defences. The civilian governor, Sir Shenton Thomas, was dead set against this proposal since the local labourers were required in industry. The labour controller in Singapore, however, advised against this on the ground that their formation would be detrimental to the production of rubber and tin and the completion of civil defence projects. He pointed out that local labour would be difficult to recruit for service in military units, for they would be required to leave their homes. Thus, Singapore went about its business, just as if the dark shadow of war was not hovering over it. The locals continued to work the fields and mines while the defences went ignored. In reality, Shenton Thomas was not oblivious to the danger of war, and in fact did cable London requesting more planes, but business and commerce were his first priorities. Throughout 1940, although the debate on Singapore's defence continued, very little was physically accomplished. Then, by the end of the year, the critical situation in the Middle East moved to the fore. In Winston Churchill's words, first, the defence of the island, secondly, the struggle in the Middle East and Mediterranean, thirdly, after June, supplies to Soviet Russia, and last of all, resistance to a Japanese attack. In October of that year, General Arthur Brooke Popham was appointed Commander-in-Chief, Far East. Upon assuming command, he quickly concluded that Singapore could not be held unless all of Malaya were also held. Brooke Popham asked for further reinforcements. The Middle East priorities precluded any chance of this. The following February, some reinforcements did arrive in the form of the 8th Australian Division. These were followed a month later by yet another Indian division. In March 1941, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival was named General Officer commanding Malaya. One historian described Percival as not the man for a crisis, and certainly not the man for a desperate campaign, a colourless character, more a staff officer than a commander, and certainly not a natural leader. Although this assessment was highly accurate, Percival was not undistinguished. During World War I, he had won the Distinguished Service Order and the Meritorious Conduct Medal. Between the wars, he served in Ireland and Malaya, and attended advanced courses at the Staff College. In Ireland, Percival earned a well-deserved reputation for being a ruthless murderer. He was so brutal in his dealings with the Irish that the Irish Republican Army placed a price on his head and diose of his troops. Percival was unable to move about freely without a bevy of bodyguards. Based on his prior service in Malaya, though, at the time of his appointment, Percival was considered the ideal man for the job. Within a week, Percival formed the conclusion that Malaya was indefensible unless it could be reinforced further. He boldly informed the British War Office that at least 6 additional divisions, 2 regiments of tanks, and more anti-tank and anti-aircraft units were urgently required. In addition, he urged that the strength of the Royal Air Force be increased. These demands fell on sympathetic but deaf ears, since, as already stated, British commitments to North Africa took precedence. Thus, Percival had to make do with what he already had. His total force numbered 88,000 men, 19,000 British, 15,200 Australians, 37,000 Indians, and 16,800 local volunteers. Since he accepted the principle that the defence of Singapore meant the defence of Malaya, forward airfields were developed in northern Malaya. Unfortunately, these airfields lacked the necessary number of planes to defend the area. In addition, the airfields themselves required Percival to scatter his forces to protect the fields from attack. So the British commander faced many obstacles. First, he did not have enough troops for adequate protection. At the same time, he had no tanks, and other military essentials were in short supply. What troops Percival did have were inadequately trained, most notably the Indian units. The only defence Singapore itself possessed were the mighty guns that faced seaward and 2 capital ships, the battleship Prince of Wales, veteran of the epic battle against the Bismarck, and the old battlecruiser Repulse. The 2 ships had been sent to Singapore in October 1941 in an effort to raise morale. The population was elated at the arrival of the huge ships, and a sense of relief settled over the naval base. The effect of the arrival of the 2 warships was not unlike the effect of the Maginot Line on the French populace. Meanwhile, try as he did to quickly construct defences, Percival's efforts proved too little, too late. In December 1941, the British force remained totally inadequate to protect the prize colony. Singapore's major defences still pointed seaward, the troops were under strength and ill-trained, and there were precious few planes and no tanks. Although there were 2 capital ships available, neither of them was an aircraft carrier. On December 4th, Yamashita's convoy set sail from Hainan, arriving off the invasion coast on the moonlit night of the 7th. Shortly after midnight, the British beach defences at Kota Baru were systematically shelled by Japanese warships. Then the amphibious forces struck. The Royal Air Force did manage to bomb the convoy and cause some initial confusion, but the Indian troops defending Kota Baru were easily overwhelmed by the superior Japanese forces. The Indian positions were situated a mere 100 yards from the water, placing them in an excellent position to rake the invading forces. Quick action saved the day for the Japanese. By driving hard into the Indian fire, the invaders circled their positions and fired into the hapless Indians from all sides. Panic swiftly spread among the defenders as the word went around that the Japanese had broken through. In fact, the Japanese were experiencing a difficult time. Percival's misfortune of having to rely on such poorly trained troops was a boon to the Japanese. As panic spread through the ranks of the defenders, the Indians evacuated their positions, including those around the airfields, leaving behind valuable equipment and supplies. Besides the undestroyed airstrip, the defenders left behind bombs and fuel, all intact and ready for Japanese use. Kota Baru was in Japanese hands in a matter of hours. The landings at Singora and Patani were routine. Initially, there was light resistance from patrols of the Thai army and local police, but it failed to amount to anything significant. At 5:20, Yamashita came ashore at Singora and established his headquarters. It was there that he first received word of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Within a few hours, a compromise was reached with the Thai government that allowed the Japanese troops to pass through the country uncontested. Of course, the Thais had little choice. Either they complied or their country would be devastated. Percival had developed a defensive plan, Operation Matador. Basically, it called for British forces to advance to wherever the Japanese landed. But when word was received of the landings at Kota Baru, the British decided that it was useless to initiate Matador, so the order went out for their forces to fall back from the Thai border to a defensive position then under construction around Jitra. This position was the key to the entire campaign. With only 500 men and a mere 10 tanks, General Matsui reached the Jitra line like a burst of thunder. The fighting was heavy, but thanks to the popular Japanese hook tactic in which troops infiltrated through the jungle and moved behind the enemy positions, the British position fell rapidly. The Jitra line was easily breached, and the Japanese were on the way toward the next immediate objective, Alloy Star. Arthur Swinson said of the action at the Jitra line, "As for the action at Jitra itself, this had proved possibly the biggest disgrace to British Indian armies since Chilianwala in the Second Sikh War of 1848. What was even more humiliating to the defenders was that the Japanese captured the line without having to deploy the entire 5th Division. The task had been accomplished by the advance guard only. Japanese losses were a mere 50 men. Not only had the Japanese easily captured an important defensive position, the panic-ridden Indians left food, ammunition, and large quantities of guns and trucks behind. In their haste to retreat, the Indian troops neglected to carry out the prescribed demolitions. Yamashita was overheard to remark that if Indian troops comprised the bulk of the British forces defending Malaya, then the rest of the job would be easy. In defence of the Indian troops, it must be stated that they had been handed a difficult assignment without benefit of the proper training or heavy weapons. In fact, it was the first time many of the Indian troops had even seen a tank. Having breached the Jitra line, the Japanese rolled south. Yamashita exuded confidence, but continued to caution that speed was of the essence during the advance. The further south the Japanese advanced, the more confident they became. The troops quickly adapted themselves to fighting in the jungle, and their confidence was bolstered by the recent victories. Fattened on captured food, strengthened with captured fuel, vehicles and ammunition, the Japanese became convinced that their opponents were inferior. The steamroller was unstoppable. The keynote of Yamashita's campaign in Malaya, wrote A.J. Barker, was advance, breakthrough, pursuit, consolidation. The tactic used at the Jitra line became the basic model for the balance of the campaign. Infiltrate the enemy line, hit them with tanks, and always apply pressure. By maintaining constant pressure, the Japanese never allowed the defenders the time needed to consolidate a new position. Yamashita's infantry even used bicycles to speed themselves along. They would pedal their way along roads and paths and carry the bikes across the rivers and streams, always maintaining the pressure on the retreating enemy. In advocating the hook tactic, Yamashita found himself in disagreement with Tsuyi, his operations officer, who wanted to keep the pressure confined to the main roads. Tsuyi considered Yamashita's encouragement of wide encirclement along the jungle paths to be expensive in terms of manpower. In a heated debate, Tsuyi was no match for the army commander. This caused him to lose face. He offered to resign, but Yamashita refused to consider it. From that time forth, however, Tsuyi became an implacable enemy who began to conspire against his commander. This vilification campaign was enthusiastically encouraged by Prime Minister Tojo, who would ultimately manage, at the end of the campaign, to deny Yamashita the fruits of the great victory he was about to win. Despite the disagreement, Yamashita continued to stick with the proven hook tactic, even utilizing seaborne flanking operations. For the British, one disaster followed another, even at sea, where the twin saviors of Singapore moved out to destroy the Japanese landings, shortly after noon on the 8th. Vice Admiral Tom Phillips, the commander of Force Z comprising the Prince of Wales, Repulse and 4 destroyers, called a conference aboard the flagship to decide what action he would take regarding the enemy landings. The Admiral decided to take Force Z north to the landing beaches, and there to blast the Japanese transports. At 17:35, the force left Singapore roads. Phillips was hoping for Royal Air Force cover, but was informed that none was available for the ships. Nevertheless, the dauntless Admiral decided to proceed. If by the 9th the force had not been sighted by the enemy, he would attempt to carry out the mission. Throughout the 9th, the sky was overcast and raining, affording Phillips the necessary cover. Unfortunately, late in the day the sky cleared and exposed Force Z to enemy reconnaissance aircraft. The force was quickly sighted by 3 Japanese planes, thereby ending all hopes for surprise. Realizing that the element of surprise was lost and that no air cover was forthcoming, that evening Phillips decided to turn back for Singapore. Shortly afterward, the Admiral received information regarding a Japanese landing at Kuantan. Without informing Singapore, Phillips decided to make for Kuantan and attack the enemy landing force. Unfortunately, a Japanese submarine sighted Force Z at 2:10 and quickly radioed its position and course. On the morning of the 10th, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were up looking for the British ships. As Phillips moved closer to Kuantan, 34 high-level and 51 torpedo planes were making for Force Z. When the British fleet arrived off Kuantan, they found the area devoid of enemy ships. Phillips decided to make a sweep of the waters to the north in hopes of locating the landing barges. Meanwhile, the radar aboard the Repulse picked up the approaching Japanese planes. Around 11 o'clock, the planes were within visual range. The attack was on. Wave after wave of planes attacked the unfortunate British force as the ship's captains tried valiantly to avoid the deadly torpedo wakes. After many hits, Captain Tennant of the Repulse gave the order to abandon ship. Captain Leach of the Prince of Wales was forced to follow suit a few minutes later. An observer from one of the destroyers commented on the attack. "It was the most impressive pattern we have ever seen. It horrified us, destroying all misconceptions in its thunder, for in that brief instant Repulse had disappeared completely, in a forest of cascading bomb bursts which, merging together, were replaced in seconds by a giant wall of water. It was a fantastic, near incredible spectacle." Captain Tennant described the loss of his ship in these words. Men were now pouring up on deck. They had all been warned 24 hours before to carry or wear their life-saving apparatus. When the ships had a 30-degree list to port, I looked over the starboard side of the bridge and saw the commander and 200 or 300 men collecting on the starboard side. I never saw the slightest sign of panic or ill discipline. I told them from the bridge how well they had fought for the ship and wished them good luck. The ship hung for at least a minute and a half to 2 minutes with a list of about 60 or 70 degrees to port, and then rolled over at 12:33 p.m. 514 men lost their lives on the Repulse, and 337 more on the Prince of Wales. Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach were not among the survivors plucked from the sea by the destroyers Electra, Express, Tenedos, and Vampire. The destruction of Force Z was one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Royal Navy. To the British in Malaya, who had placed so much hope in the capital ships, it was as a devastating blow and shattered the myth of British invincibility. The action announced to the world in abrupt fashion that the day of the capital ships was over. Ships without aircraft protection were sitting ducks. Winston Churchill was greatly affected by the loss of the 2 ships. In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. The reader of these pages will realize how many efforts, hopes, and plans foundered with these 2 ships. As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor. Over all this vast expanse, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere weak and naked. The news of the victory brought great jubilation to the Japanese. Their aircraft, operating 400 miles from base, had sunk 2 of England's most prized ships. This accomplishment, following so close on the heels of the great victory at Pearl Harbor, helped foster the myth of Japanese invincibility. The British in Malaya were deeply shocked, while many wondered if their ground forces would be able to stop the Japanese advance. Questions on Admiral Phillips's conduct off Malaya have cast a shadow on his reputation. Unfortunately, he did not survive the battle, and so was unable to come to his own defense. Why had he proceeded with the operation without air cover? Why didn't he inform Singapore of his change of plan to proceed to Kuantan? Then, after he had been located on the 10th, why had not he notified Singapore immediately? These and other questions will continue to haunt historians as they attempt to unravel the last days of Force Z. Meanwhile, following the fall of the Jitra line, the British forces retreated southward. Within 6 weeks, the capture of Malaya was complete. The British routine during this period followed a distinct pattern: retreat, halt and dig a defensive position, come under attack by Japanese forces, and take a further step backward. Over and over again, step by step, down the entire length of the peninsula, the routine was repeated. In the course of the retreat, over 20,000 Indian troops surrendered. Percival's only remaining hope was the 8th Australian Division at Johore in southern Malaya. Thus far, the Australians had done relatively well against the Japanese. Though they too had been forced to retreat, they had given the enemy a bloodletting, thus making the victory more costly. Unfortunately for the British, these better-trained troops were few in number. When Yamashita's forces made an amphibious landing on the west coast of Johore, and launched a frontal attack against the inexperienced 45th Indian Brigade. Percival was left with no choice but to fall back on Singapore, to the disappointment of the Australians who felt they could have held the enemy. The remnants of the Indian troops were withdrawn across the stone causeway connecting Singapore with the mainland, British and Australian troops forming the rear guard. On January 31, 1942, the last of the rear guard crossed the causeway. When the last troops had crossed, the link to the mainland was blown sky high. Meanwhile, in Japan, the press were already making a national hero of Yamashita. Unhappily for the general, the adulation had an adverse effect on his career, thanks to Tojo's animosity and jealousy. The Japanese forces began massing for the final drive of the campaign, the attack on Singapore. The actual city of Singapore is in the southernmost part of the island. The rest of the island is comprised of jungle and swamps interspersed with rubber and coconut plantations. The major defences were located at the naval base. Unfortunately, the massive guns there still faced seaward and would prove useless during the forthcoming battle. The defence of Singapore was in the hands of 85,000 men, including 6 recently arrived British battalions. Percival actually had numerical superiority, so in theory should have been able to thwart any Japanese attack. There were, though, some deep-seated problems. The northern portion of Singapore was literally defenceless. General Wavell, Percival's theatre commander, had recently inquired as to why no defences had been constructed in the north. Percival replied to the astonished American, British, Dutch, Australian Defence Area Commander that the construction of defensive works would have a negative impact on morale. Whereupon Wavell angrily responded that the impact on morale would be even greater when retreating troops began to cross the causeway from the mainland. Churchill ordered that Singapore be turned into a citadel. On January 20th, he signalled Wavell, "I want to make it absolutely clear that I expect every inch of ground to be defended, every scrap of material or defences to be blown to pieces to prevent capture by the enemy, and no question of surrender to be entertained until after protracted fighting among the ruins of Singapore City." For the attack, Yamashita had the services of only 60,000 troops. His heavy artillery was severely reduced, his ammunition in short supply, and his line of communication long and tenuous. Only in the air did the Japanese have the advantage thanks to the support of some 200 aircraft compared to the single squadron of Hurricane fighters remaining to the British. Yamashita knew that he had to strike quickly before the British realized the inferiority of the Japanese force. If British morale revived and they managed to put up a staunch defence, Yamashita knew that he lacked the tools for a long, drawn-out campaign. While the Japanese prepared for the attack, their planes flew over the city and subjected it to tremendous punishment. Approximately 200 people perished daily in the city from the effects of the bombing. Yamashita was a troubled man. In addition to the shortages of critical supplies, he was barraged by an interfering commander, Count Terauchi, commander of the Southern Area Army. From his headquarters in Saigon, Terauchi issued orders to the 25th Army on how to conduct the attack on Singapore. Yamashita deeply resented the Monday morning quarterbacking. He was further incensed when Terauchi sent his own chief of staff to Yamashita's headquarters with voluminous notes and instructions on how to organize the attack. Yamashita dealt with the notes by tearing them to shreds. By February 4th, the Japanese were ready to begin the attack. Yamashita assembled 200 collapsible launches powered with outboard motors and 100 larger landing craft. He then moved his 3 divisions into position along with 3,000 vehicles. On the 6th, he met with his divisional commanders and gave them their final orders. Nishimura's division would make a feint to the east on the evening of the 7th in an effort to draw the British in that direction. Then, after dark on the 8th, the 5th and 18th divisions would cross to the northwest corner of the island. Once these divisions were established, the Imperial Guards would follow. Nishimura, who already felt that the army commander had slighted him, added this to his list of grievances against Yamashita. Yamashita was depending on Percival to fall for the feint. To add to the deception, the Japanese commander had erected dummy camps on the mainland opposite the invasion area. Each day, trucks headed eastward under the watchful gaze of the British. What the British failed to see were the trucks doubling back at night. All this activity confirmed what Percival already suspected, that the Japanese would invade the northeast sector. Accordingly, he sent more ammunition to that sector. From the glass-domed tower on the grounds of the Sultan of Johore's palace, Yamashita watched the beginning of the attack on the morning of February 8th. The attack was preceded by a heavy artillery bombardment and massive airstrikes. Although British machine gun fire raked the Japanese ranks, by the morning of the 9th, thousands of the attackers were on the island and moving south. Yamashita then moved his headquarters to a rubber plantation on Singapore Island. Just before noon on that day, with the 5th and 18th Divisions already across the strait, it was time for the Imperial Guards to make their crossing. Nishimura deferred because he felt he had lost face. In reprisal for what he considered humiliation, the Guards commander brutally ordered the execution of 200 Australian and Indian troops who had been trapped in Johore. Nishimura used every method at his disposal short of outright insubordination to make things difficult for Yamashita. He questioned orders and made excuses. Yamashita said of his subordinate's attitude, "I ordered the Imperial Guards to cross the strait. Then their commander asked for further orders from me. I received a message from him that his troops were hesitating to cross because of oil flames on the surface of the water. It looked to me as if he was still upset about not being able to lead the attack. I ordered him to do his duty. Yamashita could ill afford this internal opposition because he was being pressured from above. Terauchi had promised Tokyo that Singapore would be captured on February 11th, Japan's National Foundation Day. This only served to increase the pressure on Yamashita. The fighting was intense and in many places was hand-to-hand. Percival had decided to establish a perimeter defence line around the city, reasoning that it was essential to hold the vital reservoirs supplying the city with water. In the meantime, Wavell made one final visit to Singapore on the 10th. He ordered an immediate counterattack, but was realistic enough to realise that it would have little chance of success. Wavell then left for his headquarters in Java. By the 12th, the vital road junction leading to the city was in Japanese hands. As a result, panic ensued in the city. But Yamashita was beginning to feel apprehensive. His chief supply officer had warned that he was critically short of fuel and artillery ammunition. If the capture of Singapore required a lengthy siege, the Japanese would not have the tools necessary to carry it out. That evening, Yamashita held a conference at Mutaguchi's headquarters. The army commander explained that unless further supplies were forthcoming, the guns would fall silent within 6 days. At the same time, Yamashita knew that he had to continue the battle without let-up, for if he so much as briefly allowed the British the opportunity to contemplate the situation, their morale might revive. Thus it was important to continue the attack just as if the situation was well in hand, and hope that the British would capitulate before the ammunition ran out. To nudge the British in this direction, Yamashita had a note dropped onto Percival's headquarters demanding an immediate surrender, while at the same time promising leniency. On the other hand, the note threatened reprisals should resistance continue. The message read, "Your Excellency, I, the High Command of the Nippon Army, based on the spirit of Japanese chivalry, have the honor of presenting this note to Your Excellency, advising you to surrender the whole force in Malaya. My sincere respect is due to your army, which, true to the traditional spirit of Great Britain, is bravely defending Singapore, which now stands isolated and unaided. Many fierce and gallant fights have been fought by your men and officers to the honor of British warriorship, but the development of the general war situation has already sealed the fate of Singapore, and the continuation of futile resistance would only serve to inflict direct harm and injuries to thousands of non-combatants living in the city, throwing them into further miseries and horrors of war, but also would not add anything to the honor of your army. In closing this note, I pay again my sincere respects to Your Excellency. Signed, Tomoyuki Yamashita. 1. The parliamentarian should proceed to the Bukit Timah Road. 2. The parliamentarian should bear a large white flag and the Union Jack." Percival had no intention of complying. That same day, however, the Japanese advance overran a vital British ammunition dump and a large military hospital. When the medical officers at the hospital attempted to surrender, Japanese troops swarmed into the hospital and savagely bayoneted 230 patients and 93 of the staff to death. A handful of survivors fled to the city carrying word of the atrocities. The rumour quickly spread that this same treatment was in store for everyone if Percival continued to refuse to surrender. Morale in the city had already deteriorated at a rapid rate. Now the deterioration accelerated like wildfire as news of the massacre at the hospital spread. It appeared as if Yamashita's bluff would succeed, even though he was not a party to the atrocity. My attack on Singapore was a bluff that worked. I knew that if I had to fight long for Singapore, I would be beaten. That is why surrender had to be at once. From where Percival stood, surrender now seemed the only alternative. Wavell finally authorized him to make the decision once Percival was completely satisfied in his own mind that continued resistance was no longer feasible. Wavell had reached his conclusion the day before, after receiving a wire from Churchill. "You are of course sole judge of the moment when no further results can be gained in Singapore, and should instruct Percival accordingly. Chief of the Imperial General Staff concurs." By the 14th, the only water reaching the city came from a pumping station only half a mile from the nearest Japanese position. Some parts of the city were already without water, and there was concern that disease might hit the city. Percival was informed that within 48 hours there would probably be no water available at all. On Sunday the 15th, Percival called a conference of his subordinate commanders to solicit their opinion. He left the meeting convinced that the situation was hopeless. At 10 o'clock that morning, a party of British soldiers carrying a large white flag approached the advance units of Mutaguchi's division. A few hours later, Yamashita was notified that the British were ready to discuss truce terms. The bluff had paid off. On hearing the news, Yamashita commented, "I prepared myself against being deceived and ordered the British commander to come in person." The British delegation returned to their lines and reported that Percival would have to personally go to the designated meeting place. The British commander arrived late that afternoon at the slope of Bukit Timah carrying a white flag. The hapless Percival, attired in a light tropical shirt and shorts, and Yamashita, dressed in the tunic of a Kwangtung army officer complete with leggings and boots, sat down to the table. Yamashita asked Percival if he wished to surrender unconditionally. The British commander replied in the affirmative. The next question to them was, did they have any Japanese prisoners of war? Percival said no. Then Yamashita placed the document of surrender on the table. Percival read the document, then asked permission to wait until the next day before signing. Yamashita could not afford any further delay. Feeling that perhaps the British might discover his shortages, the Japanese commander wanted an immediate surrender. Therefore, he told Percival that he had to either sign right then or the fighting would resume. The Japanese interpreter at the conference was not particularly adept, and Yamashita was rapidly losing patience. In a loud voice, he shouted to the interpreter, "Is the British army going to sign or not? Answer yes or no." At this, the dejected and startled Percival said yes. The surrender document was signed at 1810. With the surrender official, Yamashita had gained the greatest victory of any Japanese general. The heralded bastion of Singapore had fallen to him in a mere 73 days. The loss of Singapore sent shock waves throughout Asia and dramatically demonstrated that the stature of all white men in the East would never again be the same. Yamashita's forces had captured 130,000 British, Australian, Indian and Malay troops at a cost of 9,823 Japanese casualties. Without a doubt, Yamashita rightfully earned the nickname Tiger of Malaya. Lacking adequate strength and short of critical supplies, he conducted a brilliant campaign. His hook tactic had proven immensely successful, and his ability to coordinate amphibious and ground operations was masterful. The bluff during the final days of the campaign saved Japan from a long, drawn-out attritional campaign. Granted, Yamashita faced a number of inferior forces, but there were enough British formations available to have inflicted heavy losses. It was primarily Yamashita's forcefulness that brought about a successful conclusion to the campaign. On the other hand, the British had to fight an uneven struggle. The Malayan command suffered from shortages because of British Middle East commitments. Those forces that could be spared were of poor quality and lacked such essential war equipment as tanks. Force Z was a tragedy. 2 capital ships were sent to defend a country that lacked the ability to protect the ships once the battle began. As for Yamashita, after his great victory, Tojo saw to it that he did not receive the honors due him. He was sent into exile in Manchuria, only to be brought back after Tojo's fall and given command of the Philippines. Though he managed to put up an excellent defense there, problems with his superiors prevented him from fighting the Philippine campaign in his own way. After the war, Yamashita was executed for crimes he had not committed. Percival remained in a Japanese prisoner of war camp until the end of the war. On September 2, 1945, the emaciated general was present on the battleship Missouri to witness the signing of the Instrument of Surrender. General Douglas MacArthur gave Percival one of the pens used to sign the document. Because of their strategic location, the Philippine Islands became a focal point for the Japanese. If it were to fulfill its divine mission and establish the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, Japan needed control of the Philippines to protect her shipping lanes. By 1941, Japan found itself denied many essential raw materials vital to an industrial nation. Because of the war with China, the United States and other nations embargoed precious resources as a punitive measure. In July 1941, as a protest against Japan's occupation of French Indochina, the United States ceased exporting oil. Without oil, Japan's industry would be helpless. However, oil was available in Borneo, Java, and Sumatra. Tin and rubber existed in Malaya. Why could Japan not take what it needed? Cut off from the essentials for existence and with its rights as a nation challenged, Japan concluded that it had no option but to seize what it needed, even if this led to war against the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. The Philippines were directly astride the sea lanes between the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the Japanese homeland. Therefore, their strategic location made them a necessary target for conquest. Faced with the prospect of war, Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, proposed that a decisive attack be made on the American fleet based at Pearl Harbor. If this fleet were destroyed, the Philippines could be attacked without fear of the intercession of the American fleet. The invasion of the Philippines came under the jurisdiction of General Count Terauchi's Southern Army. Beneath him was the 14th Army commanded by General Masaharu Homma. The 14th Army was comprised of 2 infantry divisions, 2 tank regiments, a battalion of artillery, 3 engineering regiments, and 5 anti-aircraft battalions. This army was handed the task of capturing the Philippines. The Philippine archipelago is made up of over 7,000 islands, of which Luzon is the most important. This island is almost 41,000 square miles and is largely mountainous with many peaks reaching 6,000 feet. Some soar as high as 10,000 feet. Between the mountains are large plains. The most populous of these stretches from the coast at Lingayan Gulf southward to Luzon's principal city, Manila. The Philippines became an American colony as a result of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Since that time, the United States had run the colony in a benign, paternalistic manner. Promises of independence had been made repeatedly, but in the 1930s the Filipino people were given the promise of total independence by 1946. Their political hopes centered upon an ex-lawyer, Manuel Quezon, who became the first president of the Philippine Commonwealth in 1935. It was his job to prepare the country for independence. In 1935, the new Commonwealth's president went to Washington to invite the American Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, to come to the Philippines after his retirement and help build the country's defense force so that when full independence did come in 1946, the islands would have a proper defense force. MacArthur readily accepted the challenge. MacArthur began to tackle the objective of making the Philippines militarily capable of defending itself from any aggressor immediately. He advocated the formation of a flotilla of swift, hard-hitting patrol torpedo boats, an air fleet of some 250 planes, and a large conscripted army of 40 divisions built around a force of professional career officers and enlisted men. The Filipino people quickly came to love and revere MacArthur, but the Americans resented his aloofness. Nevertheless, he and his Chief of Staff, Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower, worked relentlessly. Their main obstacle was the same one they had encountered in the States during the 1930s: money. The Philippine government lacked the funds to provide the forces needed. Monetary obstacles were not the only problems. The conscripted troops spoke 8 distinct languages and no less than 87 different dialects. In addition, virtually 1/4 of them were illiterate, which hindered their ability to work together. Yet another problem was naval defense. Any serious attempt to defend the islands would have to rely on assistance from the United States Navy. The drawback here was the tremendous distance of the Philippines from America, as opposed to its relative nearness to Japan. MacArthur was insistent, however, that any attack against the Philippines could be met at the water's edge and thrown back into the sea. He approached the defense problem with an air of optimism, secure in the knowledge that United States air power could turn the enemy back, and that American superiority was more than capable of dealing with Japanese inferiority. Quezon and MacArthur both expected heavy American support, but priorities caused Washington to default on many of its promises. This led to a strain in relations between Washington and Manila. In July 1938, MacArthur resigned his army commission and became a full-time employee of the Philippine government. After the termination of his affiliation with the United States Army, MacArthur's status with President Quezon began to decline. The general was now simply another government employee. Quezon also had second thoughts about MacArthur's war plans. He saw how rapidly the Japanese were destroying the reputedly strong Chinese army. This frightening turn of events caused Quezon to propose to Roosevelt that the Philippines be granted their independence in 1939 instead of waiting until 1946. Aware that in any conflict between Japan and America the Philippines would become a battle zone, Quezon reasoned that by becoming an independent nation he could declare neutrality and possibly save his country. Quite naturally, Roosevelt was cool to the suggestion. Quezon's opinions were on a collision course with those of MacArthur. In the meantime, the budget for the country's armed forces dwindled. Meanwhile, the Asian situation continued to deteriorate. The Japanese had seized the whole of the Chinese coast and were making menacing gestures against French Indochina. After the rapid fall of France to the German Blitzkrieg in June 1940, Japan viewed the French colony as a piece of fruit ripe for the picking. As a result, they simply occupied the northern portion of the country. In addition to their aggression in Asia, the Japanese also signed the Tripartite Pact in September of the same year, linking the destiny of the sons of Nippon to that of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. As Japan continued to creep southward, MacArthur prepared against strong odds. While he planned, so too did the Washington strategists, who, along with the British, were even then conducting secret talks and drawing up a future strategy for the time when America finally entered the war. In June 1941, a joint war plan was adopted known as the Rainbow Five Plan. This plan stated that in the event of a two-ocean war, the European enemy would be dealt with first, leaving the forces in the Pacific to simply hold on until that was accomplished. This plan effectively wrote finis to the plan MacArthur originally expected to adopt, War Plan Orange. That plan postulated the abandonment of Manila and the withdrawal of the defenders to the Batan Peninsula. From there, and from offshore fortresses like Corregidor, Manila Bay would be defended until the American Pacific Fleet could come to the rescue. With the adoption of Rainbow Five, however, the Philippines were abandoned to their fate. In the meantime, MacArthur sought complete command of all American and Filipino forces in the islands. This was made possible when he was officially recalled to active duty on July 26, 1941. General Marshall wrote MacArthur, "Stimson and I have decided that your outstanding qualifications and vast experience in the Philippines make you the logical selection for the army in the Far East should the situation approach a crisis." The situation had indeed reached the critical stage. That same month, Japan occupied the rest of Indochina. Roosevelt reacted by freezing all Japanese assets in the United States and embargoing all shipments of materials, particularly oil, to Japan on the same day that MacArthur returned to active duty. The action of the president, especially the oil embargo, made war between the United States and Japan inevitable. The Japanese had to choose between withdrawing from Indochina and the Chinese mainland, which was unlikely, and invading Malaya and the Dutch East Indies to secure their own resources. American codebreakers followed the belligerent tone of messages as they flowed between the Japanese Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, and the foreign embassies around the world. The Japanese felt justified in their anger since both Britain and Holland declared similar embargoes. Consequently, they felt strangled and held the United States responsible. MacArthur faced an enormous challenge. He had 22,000 American troops and Philippine scouts together with a Commonwealth army of about 80,000 Filipinos of dubious quality. Besides the problems of illiteracy and different languages, many of the reservists were poorly trained, and some divisions were drastically under strength. Shortages were acute, particularly in the areas of light artillery and machine guns. The troops even lacked uniform replacements and the all-important steel helmet. In most respects, they were a levy en masse rather than an army. The only units which showed any signs of discipline and cohesion belonged to the Philippine Scouts, a mixed American and Filipino force. With this force, MacArthur faced a potential force of at least 6 million men. Nevertheless, he knew that he must accomplish all he could with the little time available and the shortage of funds. MacArthur did not, however, know of the existence of the Rainbow Five plan. General Marshall announced that it was the policy of the United States to defend the Philippines. Therefore, he did dispatch some token aid, but it was pitifully slow in arriving. From July through December, 6,083 regulars arrived, even though thousands more had been promised. Not until October did the War Department finally decide that MacArthur should be made privy to Rainbow Five. Predictably, he did not approve of it. Yet he remained optimistic that he could successfully keep the Japanese out of the Philippines altogether. The islands could then be used as a base from which enemy shipping could be attacked. Some revisions to the American plan were made as Marshall and Stimson approved many of MacArthur's defense plans. MacArthur was convinced of his ability to stop the Japanese on the beaches and proceeded to plan in that vein. He stored supplies in strategic places throughout the islands. The only drawback to this plan was that if the Japanese managed to land successfully, the defenders would be forced to retreat to Batan, just as every feasibility study of Philippine defences since 1909 had emphasized. The islanders would then be left short of supplies, particularly food. The plan was not surprising, since MacArthur was never one to prefer a purely defensive posture. Even though he might find his troops forced back into Batan, it was still his intention to fight on the beaches. But he completely underestimated the ability of the Japanese and overestimated the ability of his own forces. The United States reinforced MacArthur's command with B-17 bombers and P-40 fighters. It was erroneously believed that the Japanese would not dare attack if they knew that the Philippines were defended by a large array of warplanes. The presence of these aircraft gave a euphoric sense of false security. Even Marshall felt confident about the Philippines. He felt the United States' position in the Philippines was highly favorable. Our strength in the islands, he said, was far larger than the Japanese imagined. We were preparing not only to defend the Philippines, but to conduct an aerial offensive from these islands against Japan. If war did start, B-17s would immediately attack the enemy's naval bases and would set the paper cities of Japan on fire. This comment was made a mere 3 weeks prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Such false confidence and underestimation of the ability of the Japanese would later exact a heavy toll of the Americans and their command. Last-minute negotiations between Japanese and American diplomats in Washington proved futile. All the while, Yamamoto was preparing his forces for a surprise raid on Pearl Harbor. In late November, while MacArthur pontificated that no attack could possibly come before spring, General Homer was ordered to conquer the islands within 60 days of the opening of hostilities. Meanwhile, MacArthur concluded that Lingayan Gulf would probably be the beach chosen by the Japanese for their main landing. Besides its proximity to Manila and the natural corridor to the city via the plain, Lingayan also had areas suitable for the deployment of large forces. Accordingly, MacArthur deployed the greatest number of his forces on Luzon. The island was divided into 2 groups. The North Luzon force was under Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, West Point, 1906. This force was made up of 4 infantry divisions and the 26th United States Cavalry Regiment. The South Luzon force under Brigadier General George Parker was smaller than Wainwright's and was responsible for the defense of southern Luzon. A 3rd command was established, the Virayos Mindanao force under Brigadier General William Sharp. This force was responsible for the defense of the other major islands of the Philippines. On the naval side, the American Asiatic Fleet was under the command of Admiral Thomas Hart. This fleet should not be confused with the Pacific Fleet based in Hawaii. The Asiatic Fleet contained only a half-dozen cruisers, some destroyers, and a small force of submarines in addition to the patrol torpedo boats. Hart and MacArthur did not see eye to eye on the best strategy to adopt for the defense of the Philippines. MacArthur considered the admiral to be a pessimist lacking in aggressiveness, whereas Hart believed himself to be a realist and was aware of the limitations of his small fleet. Meanwhile, General Homer readied his army. At 47, the general had a wealth of experience behind him, including time as military attaché in London and India and as a student at the Military Staff College. Homer quickly earned a reputation as a military genius. In the 1930s, he found himself in London for a second time. When he returned to Tokyo in 1933, he was given command of the 1st Infantry Regiment. Homer was known as a moderate who opposed war with the United States and Great Britain. This pro-Western philosophy led to his making a number of influential enemies, among them Generals Tojo and Sugiyama. His hostility toward Tojo forced Homer out of Tokyo to a posting in China. The Sino-Japanese War was already in full swing when he took command of the 27th Division. While commanding this division, Homer cemented his reputation as a brilliant and courageous leader. His failure to get along with the army leaders, however, resulted in his remaining in China. In December 1940, Homer was transferred to Formosa as head of the Japanese forces there. In November of the following year, General Sugiyama notified him that he was to receive command of the 14th Army, whose task was the conquest of the Philippines. Homer was shocked to find that only 2 full divisions were assigned to the 14th Army, yet he was expected to complete his task in only 50 days. Naturally, he stated that he had too few troops and too short a time. Sugiyama was upset by Homer's questioning of his authority and quickly shot back. The 50-day period is an integral part of the strategic pattern for the entire Pacific campaign. The figure is firm, and you will have to accept it. Still not convinced, Homer continued to question his superior. Sugiyama boiled with rage and did not forget the heated debate. Back at his headquarters in Formosa, Homer continued to fume. His staff informed him that if MacArthur decided to make a stand in the Batan Peninsula, the allotted forces would be totally inadequate for the task at hand. Homer sent a message to Sugiyama emphasizing his staff's assessment. In response, he received a curt reply. The main purpose of the attack on the Philippines is the occupation of Manila, which is not only the political capital but a place of military importance. The troops opposed to you are third class and unworthy to face in battle. If therefore they retreat to Batan, there is no reason why you should not blockade them. Rebuffed, Homer and his fellow commanders then drew up their plan for the attack. They correctly decided that the American Far Eastern Air Force had to be eliminated before the invasion could begin. Once this was accomplished, the seaborne landing had a chance for success. The Japanese hoped to coincide the destruction of the American air fleet as near as possible with the attack on Pearl Harbor. They designated 2 air forces, the 5th Air Group and the 11th Air Fleet, for the attack. With a 3-to-1 advantage in aircraft, they planned to hit the Americans hard. As a further preliminary to the attack, the Japanese planned the seizure of Batan Island, midway between Formosa and the Philippines. The express purpose of this was to utilize an airstrip there for the support of the air attack. Once it was determined that air superiority had been gained, the way would be open for the main attack scheduled for Lingayan Gulf, with the main objective being the capture of Manila. To protect the flanks of his main force, Homer added landings at Apari on Luzon's northern coast, Vigan on the northwestern coastal strip, and another at Legazpi on the southern tip of the island to the plan. With the final plan drawn up, Homer waited for the final word that would send his forces into the attack. "Air raid Pearl Harbor! This is no drill!" Admiral Hart was the first American commander to hear the shocking news of the Japanese attack. Unfortunately, he neglected to pass this information along to MacArthur, who heard the news from his Chief of Staff, Sutherland. The latter was given the word by a duty officer who had been listening to a California radio station. In this roundabout way, MacArthur received word at 3:40. Shortly afterward, he received a call from Washington. On the other end of the line was General Leonard Gero, Chief of the Army's War Plans Division, confirming the news bulletin. What transpired next is in many ways a puzzle. Why was MacArthur's Air Force destroyed on the ground a full 9 hours after receipt of the news about Pearl Harbor? A great deal of confusion cloaks this particular disaster. The Japanese pilots could hardly believe their eyes when they flew over Clark Field and saw their prey bunched together just waiting to be destroyed. What had happened? Who was to blame? General Louis Brereton had earlier proposed that the B-17s be sent into the air immediately to strike at Japanese bases on Formosa. 3 times that fateful morning, Brereton approached Sutherland, and each time the latter dismissed him. Meanwhile, the bombers were in the air, but without any bombs. Finally, MacArthur himself ordered an attack on Formosa, but he scheduled it for the afternoon because of reports of fog over the target. Thus, at 11:30, the bombers were back on the ground at Clark Field being rearmed and refueled. The P-40 fighters were also down, leaving the field completely unprotected. Just at that point, Japanese aircraft, delayed by the fog from taking off from Formosa, arrived overhead and proceeded to destroy the airbase. If the B-17s had been dispatched earlier, as Brereton had suggested, the outcome might have been entirely different. MacArthur later denied ever hearing of Brereton's proposals and shifted the blame to Sutherland. Nevertheless, MacArthur was the overall commander, and his failure to order the attack condemned the air fleet. He should have reached the decision to have the planes up and out against the Formosan air bases on his own. If this was not feasible at the time, then he should have at least sent them out of range of the Japanese. For all his apparent brilliance, this costly error proved that the general was not infallible. There can be no doubt that MacArthur completely underestimated the enemy. In fact, he initially thought the Japanese had suffered a serious reverse at Pearl Harbor. When the truth became known, it was already too late. It has also been stated that MacArthur was under strict orders not to initiate any action until the Japanese opened fire. But couldn't the attack on Pearl Harbor be interpreted as the opening act of war? However, to say that this mistake resulted in the loss of the Philippines is too broad. The final outcome would probably have been the same, but the Japanese conquest might have been made more difficult. With his air arm all but destroyed, MacArthur was forced to face an enemy who controlled the skies over the battlefield. The next day, Manila received its first of many air raids. On December 10th, it was the turn of O'Neill and Nichols airfields and the Navy Yard at Cavite. Admiral Hart watched sadly as Cavite was pounded into rubble. Then came word of the loss of the Repulse and Prince of Wales by the British. Hart justifiably feared for his fleet and was determined to bring his ships to a safe port. MacArthur was startled by the naval commander's attitude, since he was counting on Hart to keep the sea lanes open for the support vessels bringing in troops and supplies from America. Hart told MacArthur that the Japanese had the Philippines completely blockaded. The general responded that it was a mere paper blockade. Hart disagreed. MacArthur then cabled Washington, stressing the absolute necessity of the United States, putting every effort into the defense of the Philippines. Naval support, he went on, was crucial to the defense. Unfortunately, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, had already written the islands off. Consequently, MacArthur found himself confronted by a seemingly impossible situation. With its air power destroyed and the Navy about to abandon it, the Philippines faced a grim future. The Japanese ground offensive began on December 10th at Apari and Vigan. The landings were made without any opposition. The 11th Division of the Philippine Army was responsible for that area of Luzon, but this division had no artillery, no transportation, and was under strength, making it totally inadequate for the defense of such a large invasion area. The greatest problem faced by the Japanese was the adverse weather. Heavy surf made transferring from transports to landing barges hazardous. Upon learning of the enemy landings, MacArthur dispatched those P-40s and B-17s that had survived the initial Japanese attack. The planes did manage to cause some damage to the Japanese transports, particularly those bringing in supplies. Nevertheless, the landings at Apari and Vigan were completely successful. These air attacks represented the last coordinated effort of the Far Eastern Air Force. After establishing their beachhead, the Japanese began moving south. The forces at Apari were called the Tanaka Detachment after their commander, Colonel Tanaka, while the Vigan forces were named for their commander, Colonel Kano. By December 12th, the Tanaka Detachment had moved more than 50 miles inside Philippine territory and had taken 3 airfields. The Kano detachment moved northward. It, too, managed to take 3 airfields. MacArthur had correctly guessed that the twin landings were merely preliminaries to a major attack and prepared his forces accordingly. He was determined to stop the Japanese when the main attack did hit. Meanwhile, Homma, no longer fearing a counterattack against Tanaka and Kano, grouped the 2 detachments together and sent them southward towards Lingayan Gulf, where they were to link up with the main landing force scheduled to land on December 22nd. During the southward advance, the Japanese were attacked by the Philippine 11th Division. The more skillful Japanese outflanked the Filipinos and quickly foiled their valiant attempt. Then the Japanese pushed on relentlessly. 2 days after the Apari and Vigan landings, the Japanese landed at Legazpi. The purpose of this landing was the acquisition of an airfield in the south that could protect the southern flank against an American attack from that direction. The Japanese landing was without incident. After quickly establishing their beachhead, they moved to occupy the airfield and started the movement northwest. 5 days later, they met their first determined resistance. On December 22nd, the Japanese force confronted the South Luzon force. In one attack, the Japanese sustained such heavy casualties that they actually turned and ran. It was the first, though short-lived, victory of the South Luzon force. Despite the setback, the landings served their purpose. Luzon was isolated. That same day, the Japanese began their main landings at Lingayan Gulf. From 76 Army and 9 naval transports, the 14th Army, equipped with artillery and 100 tanks, crashed ashore. Escorting the invasion fleet was the Japanese 3rd Fleet under Admiral Takahashi. The main landing force was General Tsujibashi's 49th Division, made up of the 1st and 2nd Formosa Regiments and the 47th Infantry Regiment. The Japanese plan called for the 47th Infantry, accompanied by a detachment of tanks, to make the first landing at Agu. 30 minutes later, the 1st Formosa would land further north at Kaba. A third landing by the Kamajima detachment was to follow at Bawang. One of the primary objectives of the landing was the capture of the main highway, Route 3, which led directly to Manila. A spur of Route 3 left Bawang and went to Baguio. The Kamajima detachment was ordered to move along the spur and seize the Naguilian airfield before moving on towards Baguio. One part of the detachment was to move north to link up with the Tanaka and Kano detachments. The remaining 2 landing forces were to head toward Demortis and Rosario and other points south. The landings began precisely on schedule on December 22nd, with the first force hitting the beach at Agu at 5:17. 10 minutes later, the 1st Formosa hit the beaches. This was followed 2 hours later by the Kamajima detachment. The biggest obstacle encountered by the Japanese was the heavy surf. The high spray of salt water ruined the signal equipment. Homma, who was aboard one of the ships, suffered a communications blackout and was literally in the dark regarding conditions ashore. Thanks to the skill of the transport commanders, however, the landing forces were saved from floundering. Opposition was light, despite MacArthur's anticipation of landings at Lingayan. With no early warning system, no mobile reserve, little artillery, and even less in the way of air forces, the defence was negligible. At Bawang, when the Kamajima detachment landed, they were met by Filipino troops who put up a wall of fire. Despite heavy casualties, the Japanese advanced inland and forced the Filipinos to withdraw. The United States Navy retaliated with a submarine attack that managed to sink 1 transport, but that was the extent of the naval opposition. The most spirited defence was provided by the few remaining B-17s that took off from Mindanao. Even this attack, however, failed to halt the invasion. Throughout that first day, the Japanese moved steadily inland toward their objectives against little opposition. Units that were sent to oppose them either lacked the spirit for the task, were badly trained, or arrived too late. All were easily swept aside. But Homma was in the dark about how rapidly his forces were actually moving. Still without communications, his fears that his units were meeting heavy opposition increased with each passing hour. Weather reports indicated that there would be no decrease in the high surf the next day, so there was little prospect that the Japanese would be able to land their artillery and heavy equipment. Therefore, fearing an American counterattack, Homma decided to shift anchorage. At 17:30, he ordered the convoy to move further south during the night to a point off Demortis, where the landings could continue the next day. In the interim, Wainwright ordered his forces to move on to Mortis to keep the vital road from falling into Japanese hands. The attempt failed. De Mortis fell as did Rosario and Sison. By the 24th, the Japanese reached Binalonan, not before meeting stiff opposition, however, from the 26th Cavalry. While the Japanese consolidated their hold on the Lingayan area, a further landing was made on Christmas Eve at Layman Bay, south of Manila, by a force under General Morioka. This area was not suited for an advance on Manila because the way was blocked by the Tayabas Mountains. Morioka was counting on surprise to make the landing a success. The landings were made at 3 points: Mauban, Antimonan, and Siane. The choice of landing beaches worked in favor of the Japanese only because the commander of the South Luzon force, General Parker, had positioned the majority of his armor on the western beaches. Because of their proximity to Manila and better landing conditions, the latter beaches were thus considered the more obvious location of an attack. The Japanese ran into stiff opposition at Mauban, where Philippine Army regulars provided a determined defense. At Siane, the Japanese landed with little opposition. After establishing their position, this force split in two, with one following the rail line towards Manila and the other advancing south to link up with Colonel Kimura's force moving up from Legazpi. En route, the Japanese ran into fierce resistance. As a result, it took them 3 days to link up with Kimura. By the evening of the 24th, the Japanese had completed the final part of their landing operations. Their casualties were a mere 84 dead and 180 wounded. By now, the invaders were firmly entrenched north and southeast of Manila and ready to close the arms of a giant pincers on the capital where Homer expected the final battle to take place. MacArthur had failed to prevent the invasion. Homer wanted the jaws of the pincers drawn shut quickly in order to catch the defenders in the open on the central plain. MacArthur realized that the only hope remaining was to order a retreat into Batan. Manila, he told President Quezon, would be declared an open city and turned over to the Japanese. The Orange Third Plan was dusted off and made ready for implementation. At the same time, MacArthur informed General Marshall that he proposed to defend Batan and hold on to Corregidor. Marshall approved and replied that he would try his best to send aid. In light of the Japanese mastery of the air and sea, however, it was hard to see how Marshall intended to carry out his pledge. Nevertheless, he did order supplies to the Philippines via Australia and Java. On December 24th, MacArthur gave the order for the withdrawal to Batan to commence. Now his entreaties to the Filipinos to fight where they stood began to work against the general. Loyal to their orders to hold on, no preparations had been made to withdraw, particularly in terms of supplies. Despite the enormous odds, the sidestep into Batan was a masterpiece. Even the Japanese marveled at the execution of the retreat. For Homer, the move was one thing he wanted to prevent since he was anxious to seek a decisive battle near Manila. The actual retreat was not an easy accomplishment by any means. In fact, even under normal circumstances, it would have been considered difficult. Under the prevailing conditions, with the enemy closing in, it appeared to be an impossible feat. Thanks to MacArthur's superb strategic mind, though, the maneuver was a distinct success. Taking a map, the general drew 5 delaying lines. He pointed out the vital bridges which either had to be held or blown up. Abandonment of these delaying lines had to be carried out with expert precision. In short, it was a strategy of stand and fight, fall back and dynamite. It was savage and vicious, but it won time. MacArthur placed the effort in the capable hands of General Wainwright. Once the wheels of the retreat were in motion, MacArthur established his headquarters on Corregidor. Manila was declared an open city, and the blackout was discontinued. Unfortunately, the Japanese bombing was not. Homer began to receive disquieting reports of MacArthur's movement into Batan. Since he had anticipated fighting the major battle at Manila, this news was received with mixed emotions. The prevailing feeling among the Japanese was that MacArthur's army was a cat entering a sack. Wainwright did a masterful job of holding back the Japanese. Though forced to give ground and fall back to newer lines, precious time was bought. His basic aim was to delay the enemy, but it took a heavy toll of his forces. By December 31st, the Japanese had approached to within 30 miles of Manila. At the same time, thousands of defenders were pouring into Batan. To gain additional time, MacArthur decided to make a stand in the area around the Columpit Bridge. He placed every available unit along a line 5 miles south of Pampanga in the Baliwag-Plaridel area. The defenders held on long enough to allow thousands to use the bridge to cross into Batan. Finally, on New Year's Day, at 5 o'clock, after making sure that the last units had crossed the bridge, Wainwright ordered the Columpit Bridge blown up. One wonders why the Japanese, with their aerial supremacy, failed to blow the bridge themselves. There is no doubt that this would have trapped many of the defenders and hindered the retreat. Although Manila was declared an open city on December 26th, the commander of the 48th Division, General Abe, did not receive authorization to enter the city until January 2nd. 2 days later, Homer established the Japanese Military Administration. The purpose of this organization was to totally supervise the life of the citizens of Manila. A curfew was announced, blackouts were reintroduced, and martial law was enforced. The Filipinos were presented with a long list of do's and don'ts. Violations were punished severely depending on the gravity of the act. Homer also established a new Philippine government and staffed it with Filipino collaborators. On the same day that Japanese troops entered Manila, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo informed Homer that the timetable for the invasion of Java had been moved up a month. This necessitated a transfer of the 48th Division from Homer to 16th Army, which was tabbed to carry out the invasion. In addition to this division, the 5th Air Group was also taken away. In the place of the 48th Division, Homer received the 65th Brigade, a force of 6,500 poorly trained troops. Thus, on the eve of his most critical battle, Homer suddenly found his strength reduced drastically. Meanwhile, the American and Philippine forces continued their systematic withdrawal to defensive positions in Batan. By January 2nd, the retreat was largely complete. It was a success. For the first time since the outbreak of hostilities, the Japanese had been outmaneuvered. Though they occupied the strategic city of Manila, access to the vital Manila Bay was denied them as long as the Americans held Batan and Corregidor.